Katharina Grosse, bonjour. We are here at Galerie Max Hetzler Paris for a special occasion, and for this special occasion you wanted this interview to be a dialogue, so thank you very much for inviting me into the frame. We are here today for the exhibition The Bedroom. The Bedroom is an exhibition you started, an artwork you started in 2004. We will talk about it more precisely a bit later, because first, as the audience may not know you or your work, I'd like to begin with a few key moments of your career. The first theme I'd like to address is the theme of liberty. And I believe that since your childhood, you had a mother who was an artist, a father who was a rector of a university, and I believe they gave you this sense of confidence and liberty from the very start.
Yeah, certainly I got encouraged by my parents, but also by my family, my brothers. My grandfather lived with us, to deal with, to be familiar with books, to take it as a daily normal habitat to read, to go to the theater, to go to the museum. These were things that were normal things. It wasn't like an effort for me, you know. I learned to play music. But the special situation of my childhood was also that my father was one of the first teachers in a university that was built after the Second World War into the area of highly industrialized cities in the Ruhr, in the middle of the country, very close to Cologne and Düsseldorf. And the Ruhr area was charcoal mining, you know, steel industry, car industry, and then they started to think about educational industries and built a new university there. And so I grew up in an area with both working class, very traditional working class, and people teaching and reading, and they were amazing. It was an amazing theater in the city. A city further on was Pina Bausch with her dance company. You know, there were all these things coming up within this old working class area, and that was an experience of freedom in a certain way, because you were not stuck in one idea of cultural life. So it was all at the same time with frictions, but also with a very natural way of coexisting at the same time.
And there is this story about your father's garage also.
Oh yeah, my mother would always say, hey, why don't you paint something here, or let's do something there, and she would provide materials to us and encourage us to do that. And so to paint large things, for example, I always liked it. I would join lots of papers together to make large paintings. So the idea of a large format, for example, was present to me since early in my life, I think.
Then you also had traveled very early, and in France, for example, in the Louvre, you also saw the paintings of Manet and Matisse. And the color of those paintings were important for you, because you realized that it was already subversive. The color didn't match, obviously, the object depicted.
That's true. So the very early inspiration for where I realized I'm drawn to it, where I had a natural, you know, without teaching. So before I started to be in art school, I went to the Louvre. I saw the big paintings by Géricault and Delacroix, and I was very, very attracted to it. I can remember that. And that is so important, because it was before influences coming to you through teaching. And also the Fauve, the early Matisse, also connecting with my experiences of German Expressionism. So the raw colors did speak to me in a very high emotional level. And I couldn't understand it back then, you know. I was maybe 18, 19, and I started to paint quite late in life. You know, I started with 19 or maybe 20, I started to paint, and whatever I saw, I broke down into these very basic colors. And then I started to be at the art school, and I got all the knowledge about, of course, the influential things back then, which were very conceptual, which were coming a lot from the American art history, post-war history. Cologne, New York had a very strong relationship, and I studied in Düsseldorf, where Joseph Beuys was teaching. And so with my longing for color and light and electricity in that energetic medium, I came into a scene that wasn't interested in that at all, So that was quite interesting for me to grow up in that time where actually photography was important, was being looked upon as the new image media, as equal to painting. And my longing for painting and for color was not at all finding a resonance there, but I got a lot from the discussions, of course, with people doing their work there.
And born in Freiburg, which is in complete nature between the mountains and the Black Forest, you were embedded because you were hiking also and climbing over there. Yeah, well, I was born there, but when I was like 5, my family moved up north into this very industrial zone. But my parents, that's right, my parents would take us like as an antidote, to this cultural and this very industrial world. They would take us to the mountains in Austria, and until I was 14 or so, or 15, I would spend all summer climbing, and in a very simple little village with not a lot of, very simple houses, but I really liked it. I liked the rocks. I liked the dry up in the mountains, on the rocks with little plants coming through, and you were all day outside, basically, that was, and to use your body to do something, to also go from that little village up on a peak and then look backwards on the village. These things are very, very strong emotions, like the change of perspective and also something that is your size, and then you see it from up as little small things. And when you're a kid, like 10 years old, and you have that experience, it's really powerful. To go back to the theme of color, there's a pivotal moment, I would say, in 1998, when you painted the Green Corner in Bern, if I'm correct. This moment, you describe a moment of crisis in some way, where you were fronting maybe a blank canvas. So what happened? What was the mechanism that released you? Yeah, I think you put it well. It was like a release into a freer way to move in the space, because I had this feeling that painting does not really make good usage of the space when it's just hung on a wall. I thought it has a different understanding of a proposal of space as well, which is not depending on the site and should not follow the rules of the architecture. I think it has different rules, different spatial rules than architectural rules. And I had a moment, I've been always thinking around those years, why not work again with the inside of a body, which is a house or a building. So I didn't think of wall painting as such, but I was thinking of the inner structure rather than more like a body that can be painted. And I had spent time in Florence like a year, and I've been seeing all these frescoes, and I was very inspired by the mundane way of surrounding your life in Italy with painting, whether it's a painted house or a little corner, or like some vignette up there in a top of a roof or something. So it was very interesting to live in an environment that had constantly a second imaginative proposal rather than the built three-dimensional matter-of-factish stonework, So there was constantly a second layer, and maybe a third and a fourth. And I was thinking that was very brilliant in the sense that it glittered. It was offering you ambiguous ways to look at your life, a constant new alternatives to where you were. Were you in a church, or were you on a piazza, or were you in the painting that depicted a scene of 300 years ago? And that was all melted together. And when I did this corner piece, I also wanted to
touch the space and the skin of the space directly with my activity and not have anything in between. And this directness of painting I find so amazingly seductive. And also it put me in a stage of being in very heightened emotional response to my work. So I wasn't in a studio and could then say, not good, good, private, goes to the public. But I had to develop everything in a public space. And I thought that was also what you described probably as a crisis, but it felt good, you know. I wasn't in a crisis in a sense of being threatened. It was more like being very heightened senses, having very heightened senses, having a very alert, almost sense of emergency that I generated by doing that. And I also had decided to only use one color, so I had right away from the start simplified my my task, and that was very freeing as well.
There's a lot of course, primary colors in your work. Your colors are very, I would say, straightforward. This corner was green. Silly question. Why not yellow or red?
No, that's a great question. I saw the space beforehand. In my eyes, I was like looking at everything, and then I realized, oh, the way that my eyes go, actually, they touch already the corners up there, you know. So my spray technique is very much linked to the fact that I can reach some places that I can't use with a little paintbrush. And then I also realized there's a greenish light in the space, which came probably from trees outside. So I wanted to take that up, and I thought to make something that defines itself very clearly. And the green I used had in itself a polychromatic allure. It was like bottle green and light at the edges, but as soon as it got more densified towards the corner, where it reflects upon itself, it turned almost like a reddish, blackish, dark, undefinable color, you know, like something dried up and not so clearly to define, and I liked that. So green has, in a way, the ability to draw in other notions of color, like a dark blue, a dark red, almost black.
And this is the moment where you realized that your core medium was the color.
Yeah, I always thought it was. I had moments in between my development where I always stepped back and I asked myself, okay, why are you doing all that stuff? You know, I was painting things I saw. I was painting things I strategically developed on the canvas. I was making things with my hands and using wax and other materials that had color. And I very often realized the only thing that everything has in common is that very, very close direct usage of industrial colors. And that's when I started with those at some point and said, okay, that's now going to be my basic medium, and from there I will see where I go.
So the color being the medium, that draws us to the theme of the surface and your own relationship to the surface and the use of the spray gun. How did it started?
Yeah, that was by chance somehow. I mean, I did stay in Marseille at some point in my life for a little while and was working there with other artists, was invited by a group of artists, and they had a spray gun and a compressor in their studios, and they said, hey, Katharina, let's try it, you might like it. And I didn't like it at all, because you have to wear a mask and so on, but I liked I really remembered how the color sits on the surface, because it's not worked in with a brush. It is on top of it. And that was a very, very strong impression I got from that one trying it. And I think using a gun all of a sudden came very naturally at the moment when I thought I would like to work on surfaces that are uneven. So I did make wall paintings with a paintbrush. and they were quite large. I was painting large walls up and down and back and forth, and wherever I came to a corner with the paintbrush, I was stopped. So I experienced that moment of being controlled by the surface. And the spray gun makes you be independent from it. You move in the space rather than in relationship to a given surface that's 2 dimensions, and then maybe the floor, the 3rd dimension. And with the spray gun, you had a multiple dimensional movement, and almost like flying, you know, you move in different ways. And that was the thing that made all of a sudden, and you called it a release, gave me that new entry point to another way of understanding the work.
I remember one of your very first artwork, which was a green painting, a little bit a soulage-like painting with leaves embedded inside. So I believe you touched a lot, you had a lot of contact with your artwork, and now I'm not sure that you're ever touching your work with this spray gun.
Yeah, you're right. So I was very invested in this idea, how do you touch the surface? And that's why I really like those early Matisse paintings, where you could see the thick pieces of oil paint and then the woven canvas in between, and also equally Robert Ryman, and you know, all these alternatives. Where is the painting actually? Where is it sitting? I thought was super fascinating. And also when you walk towards your painting and you make a decision and you get your paint and walk towards the painting, and all of a sudden you move and do something there. So this kind of change your decision making while you're actually in the process of going there. And so how does the whole process work? What is a process at all? And I thought that the spray gun made me less focused on one painting. So I could really move much faster in my studio. It changed my velocity, it changed my scope, it changed not only for the works in situ, but also the works in the studio. I could work on many things at the same time with an endless supply of paint, you know, because it's delivering paint for like 5, 6, 7, 10 minutes, whereas with the gun, with the paintbrush, you always go back and interrupt your thoughts. And I like that undisturbed movement where you don't really know where is one painting ending and the next one beginning. So that was a big change, for example. But also there was so much to discover with that tool. It wasn't a given that I knew what it did, because also there were, of course, other people who had used it, like Hans Hartung or, of course, Olsitsky, and many other people trying to eliminate their personal touch, for example. But you referred to that there was actually painting where I really had moved things into the color, into the paint as a material. And that is the thought, that correlation of something mundane taken from the everyday and meeting the idea of a painting world that is absolutely imaginative, in the sense that it does not refer to drinking coffee or, you know, the found object, in a sense. That is still a very important part of my work. And we are sitting here in an installation that has exactly that as a subject matter, as a very core structure, where these two things meet, where the inner, more or less undescribable part of the thinking part meets something where you go, okay, we've agreed on calling it books or duvet or bed or money or clothes, for example. So this correlation, this kind of crash of these two things into one, that is still in my work apparent.
The last theme I'd like to address before talking about this piece is, of course, the relationship with the space that you have, and this notion of scale that is a bit different than the size. And you were talking about you climbing and going down the mountain and offering you a different perspective according to the distance and your position. So what is this notion of scale versus size?
Yeah, I think size is like, of course, you measure things, you qualify them according to an agreed factual system, and a scale is a psychological genre, I would say. And since as artists we don't deal with facts, we deal with emotions, I think. So I'm interested in understanding how your emotional relationships change as you experience yourself, as scale shifts appear. And they appear sudden, you know, not just negotiated, like in this hike where you have 8 hours to get used to it, you know. Whereas here you have a situation, or in any other installation that I'm trying to deal with, that you turn around and all of a sudden you're the large item and you're stepping on something rather small, almost like a map, and then you turn around and then the other thing turns towards you as the more overwhelming item. So you're, according to which perspective you take in an installed multidimensional work, you're constantly negotiate with you being different according to where you are.
Again, to go a little bit back to Freiburg, and we were born in the 60s, and in the 70s, Freiburg was one of the leading city regarding ecology. Your artwork, the place you take over, you're creating an ecology. Is it something you're thinking about? Because there is this whole relationship between the building, between the visitors, between the artwork, and it's a whole microcosm in some way.
Yeah, that's true. There is an ecology of interdependence of all the items, so none of it would be visible without the other. And the second thought that comes into that development for me was that I come into a situation and I don't have to erase it so as to show the work, which is a different paradigm than I grew up with. I grew up with a generation that would say, okay, now Roscoe is over, objecthood, you know, so that you replace, so the idea of the avant-garde replacing the so far established rules or systematized creative thoughts. And I think that is interesting that you work with something given in a way that it still shines through. So the painting, for example, has always to have a certain size that allows me to scale up, but at the same time allow for the existing to be as large as what I bring to the table. So it's really something that from the beginning was fascinating me when I painted, that I had, let's say, green on the surface and then I put yellow over some of it, and then I thought that is really weird because the territory of the green gets now diminished by the yellow. Isn't that also a hierarchical struggle rather than only a negotiation between two tones? So I was trying to always paint in a way that the green would come through, you know, that all the structures still speak through. That's why I was so interested early on in my life in the Matisses, for example, because you can always see the canvas shine through at some point. There's always like a little hole into the other realm.
To dive into the cliché, sorry for that, of nature versus culture. Mm-hmm. Your work is huge, so you need to plan it. You are you have a huge team. I think that you work with your brother, who's an engineer, and so it requires a lot of culture, if I may say. Yet, when you execute the artwork, you describe it as something that is more a thought than an idea, something more visceral, and there's a feedback between you and the artwork. So how do you make cohabit this over-planning thing that is very heavy and this more natural and visceral, as you describe it, gesture?
Yeah, you just said it actually really beautifully, because when you work with a team, planning is and negotiating and understanding each other is key. So within the planning process, there's also a lot of back and forth. So that is on another time scale, also an open process, but then at some point we decide and take the decisions with us. And when you are then on site, these decisions also get rearranged. So there are a lot of particles that I can still work with. And then also what actually has to do with the painting as such is not coming just from now. It is a developed process that, if you will, has also a certain planning and has a set of rules that I don't fundamentally touch when I work. There are certain things I can't do, even though I would like maybe to do them at some point, but they would destroy the ecology of the work. But yet, at the same time, the development of the painting in the space is then restricted to a very short amount of time, and I also have to be careful about how much I can do there, so it is not as spontaneous as you think it is, but of course, the impetus it has to have, the visceral directness it has to have, that is very important to maintain and to get through. But that has to do also with planning. But the planning is computing of your moves in your head, I think. Yeah, and that is very fast. So it might even use, and also combined to your movement. So it's nothing where you go, it has to look like this, and that's what you then do. So it is absolutely independent of an aim or a goal,
I'm going to try to encapsulate all these notions in your relationship with the space, because people often see your artwork indoor, but you've done a lot of work also outdoor. And the way you describe it, I'm going to try to quote you. The work is not abstract, but offering an illusion in the sense of a potential reality. So it seems to be almost a quantum vision of the world. Is it a good sum up of your work, if we may sum it up?
That's great.
Then, as a transition for the bedroom, people may think that your work is in situ, which means that you bend your own artwork as a reverence to the place or the room you're occupying, but this is not the case. You describe your work as an unexpected guest, and maybe it's the building or the environment that bends under your artwork.
Well, sure, I take the place for granted. I don't discuss may I or may I not have it. So that is certainly one of my very natural gifts, I would say. And on the other hand, I think that it is important to articulate the work as independent from it, as coming in as something on the turn. And I think that has to do with the fact that I like spaces that are already in a turning moment. Like this place here, you come in and you would maybe expect also a domestic space, or a space that is used for domestic functions, offices or whatever. And then it's turned into a gallery, which is already like a turning point for your expectation in a sense. And then I go into it and turn it back into a domestic space, or with a domestic setting and domestic emotion that I do in a way that it is exposed to the public again. So I like these moments where you have something that already pivots, like the big painting I did outside of New York at the coast, which was already damaged by a big storm. So the sand was in the building. You didn't know, does the building turn up out of the sand or does it disappear? And I have this moment in time where I go onto it and use it as something that it then gets it transformed again. I need spaces that already have the potential for a swivel, which is not so clear. And that makes the space also sturdy enough to deal with me coming in. Yeah, I think that is a good, the relationship has to be on an equal footing to let both things evolve and not be all of a sudden fighting in a hierarchical sense. And that gives me a lot of freedom. That gives me that allows me to actually ignore. And I think painting has such an independence from space. As such, it is a proposal for a world that is manifested in a realm of a reality that's very hard to pin down.
And this goes with your consideration of color as a medium, as
Yes.
something mobile that doesn't rely on the space or even the surface.
Yeah, well, it does need, of course, some sort of carrier in a sense, but you're right. I mean, also, colors as such are already complete. Red is complete, or yellow is complete. There is not a question of what is missing, what is the part of the story, you know. It's a little bit like you look at emotions, they're already complete. They don't need the narrative of she hit him because he was mean or something, or he was very, very aggressive because he hadn't eaten. You know, these things are not, I like to look at these energies as naked, around us, and that's the same with color. That's why I find it so amazing to confront it with then something very functional, such as an exhibition space or a house or a tree, like very iconic material proposals, or even like the books that are here that are a stand-in for a public knowledge and a very personal understanding of it, you know. So where these two things coincide, I find that fascinating.
And so talking about the mobility of the color and the artwork, let's dive into the bedroom. It's an artwork you've started, you first showed in 2004 in Düsseldorf, then it moved to Stockholm. So what was the idea at that time? Because you deal a lot with public spaces, and this is really an intimate space. Is it linked to your memory of your childhood memory when you told that you woke up and you saw the shadows entering your room and you wanted to erase it with a paintbrush?
Yeah, I think they are linked to one another in a certain sense, and this memory of the childhood only became meaningful to me because I'm a painter, and I became the painter that I'm now. That also that kind of appearance of myself in spaces and painting there is also like certainly absolutely a gesture of disagreement, you know. Don't like it. This has to go. This has to go, you know, but in a way that I propose something else. So it's not a destructive, I would say, but at the same time a very life-inspiring gesture that I try to build with this disagreement, and at the same time a proposal for how we could live. But then coming back to this question of yours of the first time I did this piece, and it was indeed in my own space. So it wasn't a showroom, it was my apartment, and back then I had two places where I lived, in Berlin and in Düsseldorf, and I was dissatisfied with showing in places that were decidedly exhibition spaces, and I had a lot of things at the same time. I didn't like my work anymore. It got very large, and I was thinking something small, something that is only in my own space, that has not been given to me. What would that feel like, I was thinking, if I would paint over my own possessions, the things I've bought, the things that are dear to me? Would that change the attitude of my work? Would I look at my work in a different way? That was my starting point. And then I was debating with myself, should I paint over my office? But then I thought the people that work for me would be also maybe find that aggressive. So I thought, okay, maybe the bedroom is better. And I only had one piece of furniture at the time, that was my bed. I didn't have anything that I owned or had ever bought. I had very little interest in domestic spaces until then. You know, I was only investing into studios and maybe a little apartment. And so I decided to paint it over the way I had left it. So I lived in Berlin for a week or so and then came back and painted it. And I think I only showed it to 3 people. that 3 curators in the city saw it. And then the photographer saw it, and then a friend of mine who lived also in the apartment, we had shared it at that time. And that was a big shift in my work, because it was for the first time that I had put in so many items that were having the potential to narrate a story, and painting over them, splitting up the contour lines between the objects and going over them with the same color, and annihilating in a certain sense their separation from one another, and yet they were still there. That was a big shift that allowed me to deal with also the idea of the abstract in a totally new way, which would exclude and take it as a stance and a privilege to exclude all these narrative personal things. And I really liked it. I thought it was amazing.
So you're telling me that you showed it to 3 or 4 persons only. So you did it for yourself and not to be exhibited before Stockholm?
Yeah, exactly. I did do that, and then I realized the potential of it, and I kept it also for quite a while. I kept it for half a year or so, or maybe longer even. I bought another bed, you know, and I slept in a small bed next to that bed. And when I was invited to Stockholm, that was in Magazine 3, that is an old magazine for, was an old storage space, I think, for corn, and now became the exhibition space. I realized that I could maybe pull something into the installation and enlarge the bedroom and make it more absurd, stage it in a different way. So it was actually staging it. The first time it wasn't a staged piece. I just used it as I had it. And it was, in a way, you would call that maybe authentic. Whereas the staging of the piece is a really important step. So put it onto a theatrical, more condensed emotional situation where you very clearly influence every item that's in it. And this is even here more so the case. So this time it really is the bed that I used back then, which I still kept. And I also did use a couple of things that I used back then and staged the old piece, made it even more theatrical in a sense, because the paintings that are around it then shifted from, so here was a painting that's now in the gallery over in the street, and then another painting got painted out of this process. So painting over paintings at the same time that you paint over your possessions was then something that led me into looking further into that clash of the personal and the public.
And why did you want to show it now, almost 20 years after?
Yeah, it had to do with the offer of Samia and Max to do a show here, and we had done a very beautiful and very comprehensive show with paintings in Berlin earlier this year. And I thought it would be really fantastic if we could draw in the other big part of my practice into this collaboration with the gallery. And I came here and I was very intrigued by going through these different doors. So the big wooden door, and then the other wooden door, and another door, and then you come into this changed place, which is like a shell into an old building, which is very rare to find, and even more so in the Marais, in this amazing old place of the city. And it came also up in my interests to look closer into these questions of staging work, exhibiting work, and also using this friction between the internal and the external, which when they meet, something comes about. It is not really like that you cross a border, but I wanted to show that touch they have, you know, where they actually really come into a relationship almost. And that I had never really timed the right space for it, you know, and not the knowledge either. When I used it back then in Stockholm, that was really just after I had done the work in my own house. But here I have a different way to use experiences I have collected, also with the missing painting here, and then the ability I had to show it over there, over the street, so that even going over the street is part of the extending, so to speak, the idea of working with what you see. So people go there and then have to reconnect to here and are very active, and it's not far. So these different conditions are rare to find, and they were here, and then they challenged me to think about the work in a different way.
Talking about the exhibiting conditions and the intimacy in some ways. Last year I talked with Megan Rooney, with whom you've shared an exhibition in the Fondation Louis Vuitton. She's painting on walls like you, but she told me that she had a struggle to go back to small formats, to paint small paintings. Would you be able to go back to a small piece of paper or small painting, considering the freedom that the space and the Spraygan gave you?
Yeah, I love it. I love to go back to little watercolors, and sometimes I have the practice of painting on my kitchen table. And now I have a little watercolor studio in my house, and I like the intimacy and the immediacy of it as well. But it's not always happening at the same time, you know. So it could be that I come back to my life in Berlin and I maybe do it. I even had brought materials here to the hotel room, but I haven't used it so far. So, but I do love the change. So I think, but it is not easy. It takes time, so it can sometimes be that if I paint on paper that I might need a month or so to accommodate my movements, my thinking, and also my interests. It's not a formal problem, it's more a problem of where do I get engaged? Do I find something that I want to find out? And the best thing is really to feel whether you need it or... and sometimes very large exhibitions can also be too large. You know, you have to kind of accommodate your scope. I think it is absolutely important to have everything, like drawings. Every kind of touch can be informative. There is no need only to do this. You know, it makes the work very complex for yourself, in terms of organization as well. But it's a good thing.
And maybe as a conclusion, a long conclusion, I'm sorry, but talking about the various state of painting, as you've said, in the 70s, people were claiming the end of painting, throwing away Rothko paintings, and you founded a foundation called the Wunderblock Foundation. And the purpose of it is to explore the meanings and the functions of painting. And what is the goal here, and what is the research that you are conducting?
Yeah, I mean, it is coming from different points of interest. One of them is that I needed a larger studio. I wanted to have also the challenge of a space that I couldn't control so easily. I'm always looking for a place that feels like painting outside, but that is protected. So I found a big farmland outside of Berlin for that purpose, not far, an hour away. It's an old farm that had 3 large barns made of concrete, really big, beautiful spaces, and smaller stables, and it has about 8 buildings. And at the same time I was thinking, how could I maybe pass on some of my heritage, both knowledge, archives, library, but also works on the one hand, and on the other hand also possibilities for younger artists to work or get in touch with experiencing a painting in the most adventurous form, you know. So maybe I could support artists or writers or poets or people who work in that idea, with that idea. And I've been profiting early on in my life, being supported by the Warhol Foundation or Polo Krasner Foundation or Schmidt-Rottluff Foundation in Germany, who grants 2 years support even after art school. That was important, you know, so gave me time to do things and not be right away looking for market success. And I don't have a family that is going to take care of my estate. So the Wunderblock is now looking into funding any kind of research in questions that are urgent. How can a painting appear in our life? How can it be adapted to what is happening with image sources, for example? How does it still rely and bring the old knowledge of painting into our everyday understanding of it, into our actualized thought about it? I think painting is such an amazing old, it's such an old, since early days, source of how a body expresses a thought that is not only making life in terms of technical, like growing potatoes or something. And so it harks us back into these very early roots of our being as well, I think. And that's why I'm so interested in contributing somehow a platform for it. And so we're in the early stages. I've developed a studio there, a summer studio and a winter studio, but I also want to make special spaces that are different from something you have maybe at home. So a residency program, a normal one, I wouldn't think is so interesting, but more something where you have one bed and a huge space with a library and then you work there maybe for 2 weeks or something, where a largesse of brain is somehow coming about. So we are also not wanting to have everything done in the normal way, but maybe we have summer spaces that are really big and winter spaces that are small, that don't require a lot of heating. So the country life, I think, is also a different life. It has a different comfort. It connects you in a different way to your everyday needs. So I'm really interested in also finding out how it can be done in a sustainable way, where we use different resources and not only the normal comfort standard that we are used to.
Being the artist you are today, is there a challenge yet to come, an ambition that you would have in the next years?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges are so many and we share them. Of course, the resources we have and the ability to negotiate common ground on the basis of the acknowledgement of diversity will be a huge challenge. How do we deal with one another? Do you find ways to also bridge the generational conflicts that are ingrained in that problem, I think? But I think there is also, I mean, what we do as artists, we try to provide as many alternatives to given problems as possible. And I think that art is that source of knowledge that can help us there. So my challenge is to do and to develop as much as I can in my field and go forward there. And of course, I don't know what's next. That's for sure.
So we can say as a conclusion that this is definitely not the end of painting.
Definitely not. It's the beginning of painting, I think.
Katharina Grosse, thank you very much for your time.
I thank you.